Hey, there you are. Come on in. Let's go talk about pocket knives. Sadly, I'm missing the footage from the beginning of this project. When this part of the video begins, I already had removed the center pin and the handles were cracked. This knife is marked by Moore Handley Hardware Company and is model A1254. Moore Handley was a hardware store in Birmingham, Alabama that was founded around 1881. They grew to become the third largest hardware wholesaler in the United States at one time. Then they went out of business around 2009. Now, I can't find any records of which cutlery company made this knife for Moore Handley. From the construction, I'm guessing that it was a U.S. company, possibly either Camillus or Boker USA, but that's just a guess. A friend of mine recently acquired this knife and asked if I could repair it for him. It was in very rough shape. The handles had shrunk, they were too brittle, the main blade had been tipped and reprofiled, the secondary blade was worn down so far as to be just completely unusable. Both blades were covered in marks from having been sharpened on a grinder. I knew that it would be next to impossible to find any correct blades for this knife. I thought about removing that secondary blade, then was struck by how similar the shape is to a punch blade. So I began to wonder, could I actually reshape it into one? Disassembling the knife, I began to reprofile that blade. I figured I had nothing to lose. If the idea did not work, I could still permanently remove the blade instead. Then I locked the blade into a vise and used the jaws of the vise as a straight edge. Then with a sanding drum and my rotary tool, I thinned the blade out from the long pull nail neck all the way out toward the edge, giving it a deep hollow grind. After comparing my newly modified blade to a real punch blade, I made a few more touch-ups on the belt sander. There we go. Looks good. A little larger, but it is a larger knife. It's exactly what I wanted. So now it's time to clean up this knife and put on some new handles. The old handles have got to come off first. They're pinned in place, so I cut away the inside of those pins and remove the old handles. Then I went ahead and engraved my initials and the date on the pile side handle. That's something that normally I have been doing later in the process, but especially with an equal end pattern like this, it's easy to get the two handles mixed up when you don't have anything on them, any outer handle material. So rather than repeatedly test fitting the parts later, trying to remember which is which, I just go ahead and mark it this way. I picked out some Catalina bone handles. Here you see me sanding the backside of the bone, as sometimes they're not very flat from the factory. This really provides better adhesion. Once that's done, I'll begin sanding them down to length. Now these are already close enough in length that I only need to sand the ends a little bit to make them fit, but the pieces of bone are too thin for these heavy bolsters. So I decided to pick out some blue G10 liners to go underneath. They make the thickness perfect, but I wish now that I had chosen green instead. It just would have matched the color of the handles a little better. Then I discovered that I had lost my bottle of glue. I don't know where I misplaced it. I chose to use this super glue instead because I had it on hand. It should hold more than well enough, especially with the fact that we also pin the handles after we glue them. Here you see I glue down the liners first, then we'll glue the bone down on top of that. Since super glue does not take long to cure, in just a few minutes I can drill the holes, taper them, and install the handle pins. Here you can see me using my flaring tool clamp to pre-peen one side of the pin. This prevents me from trying to peen that pin while it's sitting against the bone. I have cracked and destroyed more than one bone handle while trying to peen the pins. Once that pin is ready, I can put it in the handle, cut and peen it, then do the same thing for the other 3 pins. It allows for safer peening as well as less waste of pin material. And as you can see, I only have to tap it hard enough just to set the pin into place. I'm not tapping it nearly as hard as I do when I'm peening it. Then I flip it over, peen the inside. Once that's done, we'll sand it flat and smooth, and this handle is ready. I've decided to reuse the original shield on this knife. Inletting is the act of cutting the shape of the shield into the handle so that the shield is sitting flush on the surface of the handle, not sticking out or sitting proud, as we call it. Now there are better, more professional ways of inletting a shield, but as you'll see here, it can be done by hand with a rotary tool. First, I take my time to get the shield centered, both top to bottom and from side to side. Then I mark around it heavily with a pencil. Now I've tried ink, but it tends to soak into the bone and leaves a stain that you can't remove. Unfortunately, with this pattern on the bone, I can hardly see my pencil marks. After I get the center cut out, I try the pencil a few more times before just giving up. After that, I cut away some material, stop and do a test fit, then keep doing that over and over until the shield fits. The cutting bit that I'm using is a carbide cylinder burr that also cuts on the flat end. I have a few inexpensive fine-tipped diamond-coated bits that I also use from time to time to get in the small details. But with this knife, I was able to do it all with this burr. So we got this one, the shield glued in place. The glue has set. I had a little trouble cleaning the glue off. That style glue, it foams outward, and it want to foam out around that, so I had to clean it up a little bit with a wire brush, which I did not like doing, but that's just what it took. My shield is a little bit proud on this side, and I've got some scratches from that wire brush. I'm going to smooth it very gently on the sander. Then we'll begin contouring this down to fit and clean the blades up, put this knife together. I've polished the main blade as much as I dare. There's still a lot of pitting and deep scratches on the blade, and obtaining a mirror finish would remove too much metal. All that I did was reshape the tip to make it look a bit more normal, and lightly sand and polish the blade's surface to remove the worst of the imperfections. This knife will never be a museum piece anyway. As you can see, my punch blade looks pretty good. There's a slight ridge below the nail nick, but it's still fairly easy to hook with the thumb after I assemble the knife. I'm proud of how this turned out. Now we begin assembling. Now we run into another problem. The spring on our secondary blade is sitting too low. That's caused by the spring and the tang of the knife both being worn down over the years. This blade was obviously used the most. The blade snaps well enough that I don't need to move the hole on it, but I will need to build up that worn spring to make all the parts fit better, and we'll start by disassembling the knife. You can see the divot that's worn into the end of that spring. I will sand that spot flat again, then we'll solder in a piece of steel to build it back up to its original height. This broken bandsaw blade is the perfect size to fill in that missing piece. I'll sand the teeth off of it at first and sand the surface of that blade so the solder will stick. I'll coat both pieces with flux paste and heat them with a blue flame cigarette lighter. I used to use a propane torch, but the bottle gets too cold in the wintertime to even work at all. These lighters are small enough that I can carry them in my pocket to warm them up if it's cold weather. They're also very inexpensive, and the small size makes them easy to handle. Heating the back spring does remove the temper from the steel and softens it a little bit, but so far I've had no problems from this. Most springs are tempered too hard in my opinion anyway, which makes them prone to breaking. These springs are still very springy after soldering in onto the ends. Never had an issue with that. Now I'll sand the edges smooth, starting with the end of the spring and then sanding both sides. After that, I will do the top edge of it, thinning it down to the height that I need. Now I keep dipping the piece of spring in the water to keep it cool, or the solder could melt and we'll just have to start this part all over. There we go, looks nice. Now we reassemble the knife. I'll speed this part up again since you've seen it before on this same knife. After reassembly, I'll test the knife again. The spring is still recessed in a little bit, but not nearly as bad as before. I can live with this. Pinning the knife is a straightforward process. If you've not seen it on my other videos, I smooth the ends of the pin with a file, then tap gently until the pin spreads outward and fills the end of the hole. And the hole is flared or chamfered, of course. Since this video was filmed, I have purchased a set of feeler gauges to use as slackners. Slackner is a thin feeler gauge you'll insert between the liner and the blade, and that way you can get the tension just right. Now, I've used slackners in the past, but I quit using them in the last year or two. I've peened enough that I can get them till it just feels right. But I've also noticed that occasionally I have a hard time getting the pin to disappear when I sand the bolsters. So I believe that I'll try using the slackener again to see if I can peen the pen a little bit more with a little more force without getting it too tight. Now, for me, knife work is all a series of small experiments. I change things fairly often on a regular basis and keep trying different ways of doing the same thing, finding small improvements as I go. Now, back at the sander, I sand down the kick for our new punch blade. Now this blade sits proud, meaning that it sits up too high when the knife is closed. If you reach your hand in your pocket with a proud blade, you're liable to stick your finger. Now usually I'll file a kick by hand, but this one needs a lot more material removed. So I'm using a 400 grit belt, which should do the work slowly enough. Now I'll sharpen both blades. Using a sander to sharpen a blade is not ideal, but it gives me a starting point to use when sharpening by hand. That's my preferred method. I try to remember occasionally to show bolsters on the camera as I sand those. You'll see here in a moment I sand a little bit, flash the bolster up for the camera. Basically, I sand them against the platen with a rolling motion until the head of that pen is smooth with the rest of the bolster. Then I'll move up to the slack part of the belt and sand it there until the outline of the pen disappears, if it will. Now I go straight from a 400 grit belt to a polishing wheel. I don't show the polishing wheel on the videos because it's at the other end of the shop, the lighting is terrible, and I can finish polishing it faster than I can move my camera equipment over there and back again. I am currently investing in more cameras and equipment, so hopefully I'll be able to include more shots of this in the future. In closing, I've reprofiled blades before, but I tell you I've never done anything as ambitious as machining out a punch blade by hand. But I have to tell you it was a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed this knife. I'm especially proud of how it turned out, and I believe the owner will enjoy it a lot too. I certainly hope so, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. Thank you.